My child, when are you going to get married? All my friends are grandparents now.
Can you imagine, one day, the person you raised and sheltered your entire life, bluntly telling you, "You're not important enough to be at my wedding"? It sounds cruel, but that was the pain Margaret, a mother in her 70s, had to face. For her, the wedding of Ethan, her only son, was supposed to be the greatest comfort after years of living alone since her husband's passing. Margaret had prepared for that day with all her excitement. A blush pink dress hanging in her closet, a new pair of shoes bought with her savings, and even a wedding gift she had scrimped and saved for. In her imagination, it would be the happiest day of her life. But everything collapsed with a single phone call. It wasn't Ethan, but Sophie, her future daughter-in-law who had received her help countless times, who spoke with a sharp, cold voice. "We got married yesterday. We only invited special people." Those two words, special people, felt like a knife straight through her heart. She was stunned, her trembling hand clutching the phone as her heart tightened. Ethan, her son, sat there, but avoided his mother's gaze. Sophie smirked coldly on the sofa that Margaret herself had bought for the couple. Questions flooded her mind. Where did I go wrong? Weren't 3 years of paying their rent, providing their meals, and covering their bills enough to make me special? Every corner of the house, every item, reminded her of her sacrifices. The pink dress in the closet was now just a testament to her naivety. The money she had intended to give as a wedding gift was now meaningless. Even Sophie's brilliant white wedding dress on social media was purchased with the $800 Margaret had given her not long ago. Night fell, and the large room sank into silence. Margaret lay in bed, tears soaking her pillow. She cried not just from sadness, but from the humiliation of a mother who had been cast aside. For the past 3 years, she had lived like a walking wallet, pouring all her money into others, only to receive invisibility in return. How many times did I eat porridge instead of a proper meal? How many times did I postpone my own doctor's appointments just to provide for them? And still, it wasn't enough to be special people, she whispered in the darkness, her voice trembling. After that shock, Margaret's once quiet house became suffocating. Every wall, every item she had ever bought for her son and daughter-in-law now turned into evidence of a painful truth. Her love was only valuable when it came with money. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, spreading out her expense records as if they could answer the pain in her heart. The cold numbers appeared. $500 every month for rent, plus medicine, food, and a few repairs in Ethan and Sophie's apartment. 3 years, over $30,000, had vanished. When Margaret totaled the sum, she was stunned. So many years of saving from her pension, so many silent sacrifices, all for one cruel statement. We only invited special people. Every morning, when she opened her closet, the blush pink dress still hung neatly. It was no longer a dream, but a scar. Margaret reached out to touch the soft fabric, then let her hand fall, as if it were heavier than stone. The dress that once symbolized happiness now only reminded her of her own naivety. Her last hope that the wedding might have been just a small, quick ceremony vanished when she opened social media. On the screen, Sophie glowed in a pristine white dress. Ethan held her hand, his eyes shining. Beside them were Sophie's parents, siblings, and relatives. All present, raising their glasses in a toast, smiling brightly. Only one person was missing: Margaret. Ironically, she realized that every detail in that happy picture bore her mark. From the wedding dress Sophie wore, to the bouquet she held, to even the small reception. All of it was, in one way or another, funded by the money she had sent. But no one mentioned her. Not a word of thanks. Not a single invitation. Night fell, and Margaret lay in her wide bed, hearing the loud beat of her own heart. She cried, but her tears contained not just sadness, but also humiliation. For the first time in her life, she felt not only forgotten, but deliberately cast aside. How many times did I go hungry to send them money? How many times did I cancel my own plans to run to the bank? And yet, in the end, I was worth nothing in my son's eyes, she whispered in the darkness. That harsh reality stabbed at her heart like a slow, deliberate knife. And then, a thought flashed. Perhaps I was never loved for who I am. They only loved what I could provide. A week passed after that secret wedding. The wound in Margaret's heart had not yet healed, but the pain had begun to turn into silence, into long, sleepless nights. She thought she wouldn't have to hear Sophie's voice for a long time. But that afternoon, the phone rang, and the screen showed her daughter-in-law's name. Margaret hesitated. Her finger trembled over the answer button, part of her wanting to decline, another part wanting to know what more they could possibly say after everything. Finally, she pressed the button. Sophie's voice came through, but this time it was not confident or cold. It was trembling, rushed, and filled with desperation. Margaret, the rent is overdue. The landlord is threatening to evict us. If we don't pay this week, we'll lose our home. Please, can you help us one more time? Margaret was silent for a few seconds. She remembered all the times she had rushed to the bank at the last minute to wire them money, all the times she had canceled her own small plans just to ensure Ethan and Sophie had a roof over their heads. Now, after excluding her from their wedding, they were calling again, as if nothing had ever happened. She took a deep breath and replied, her voice so calm it surprised even herself. Didn't I tell you before, Sophie? I only help people who are special. On the other end of the line, a long silence stretched. Margaret could hear her own heart beating in her chest. This time, it wasn't her who was trembling, but Sophie. Margaret, I don't understand. You're like a second mother to me. We've always been special to you. Sophie stammered. Margaret let out a soft, bitter laugh. She had heard those sweet words too many times. It was the tone Sophie always used when she needed money for a dress, a ring, or to cover their honeymoon. Behind it, there was nothing but deceit. In that moment, Margaret realized something. For so many years, she had been walking on thin ice, trying to be the perfect mother, the easygoing mother-in-law, just to earn a little affection. But in the end, the only thing she received was exploitation. That night, Margaret sat in the dark room, her eyes red. But this time, her tears were not just of sadness. They carried anger and years of accumulated resentment. She cried for herself, for the woman who had sacrificed her whole life but had never received any appreciation. And when the morning came, she was no longer the weak Margaret of the day before. In the mirror, beyond the familiar wrinkles, there was a new look in her eyes, sharp and resolute. Something had awakened within her. After a long night of tears, Margaret woke up with a strange feeling. The room was the same. The early sun still peeked through the curtains as it did every day. But something inside her had changed. There was no more trembling, no more waiting for a call from Ethan. Instead, there was a strange quietness, mixed with determination. She sat in front of the mirror, looking directly into her own eyes. For so many years, those eyes had been tired, pleading for a little love in return. But today, Margaret saw a new glint in them, cold but firm. She whispered to herself, "Enough. I have given too much. Now it's my turn." She made a cup of coffee and sat down at the table that had once been piled with Ethan and Sophie's bills. But this time, instead of tracking expenses for them, she took out a pen and paper to calculate for herself. For the first time in years, Margaret wanted to know exactly how much she had left and how she would live if she no longer had to support two grown adults who couldn't fend for themselves. The numbers that appeared initially stunned her. Over $30,000 had vanished in just a few years, money that would have been enough for vacations, for the art classes she had dreamed of, for a peaceful old age. She felt a lump in her throat, but at the same time, a thought flashed. It's not too late. I can still change. That afternoon, Margaret put on a light jacket and went outside. It had been a long time since she had gone for a walk that wasn't to send money or buy things for Ethan and Sophie. She walked slowly, admiring the park, listening to the birds sing. Suddenly, she remembered Ethan as a little boy, the boy who used to hug her tightly and whisper, "You are the best mom in the world." A hot tear rolled down her cheek, but Margaret quickly wiped it away. That little boy was gone. Now, all that remained was a selfish man who treated his mother like a bank. That evening, when the phone rang continuously, first Ethan, then Sophie, she just looked at the screen and let it go dark. For the first time in years, she didn't rush to answer, hoping for an apology. She sat, sipping her coffee, feeling a strange sense of peace. The next day, Margaret went to the bank. The manager was surprised when she requested to cancel all automatic money transfers. He asked, "Are you sure, Mrs. Margaret? It's been 3 years, every month without fail." She smiled and nodded. "Yes, I am finally sure." As she signed the paper, Margaret felt as if she had just cut a chain that had bound her for too long. Stepping out of the bank, she took a deep breath. The spring air suddenly felt fresher. On her way home, she wondered, why should I be afraid to keep what is mine? Why must I buy affection from people who don't truly love me? Margaret knew the fight with Ethan and Sophie wasn't over. There would be more phone calls, more pleas, perhaps even threats. But at least she had an answer for herself. She was no longer the submissive mother, quietly withdrawing money to be called family. She was Margaret, a woman who had learned to say enough. 3 days after Margaret canceled all money transfers, her doorbell rang incessantly. She had expected this, but her heart still ached when she looked through the peephole. Ethan and Sophie were standing right outside, their faces tense. "Mom, open the door. We need to talk," Ethan said, banging his hand on the door. Margaret slowly turned the handle. When the door opened a crack, she could clearly see the difference in their eyes. The proud smiles from their wedding day were gone, as was their confident demeanor. All that remained was resentment and confusion. Sophie spoke first, her voice sharp. "Why did you stop the transfers? Do you have any idea what kind of trouble we're in?" Margaret looked straight at her, her gaze calm. "Because I realized that if I continued, I would be killing myself in silence. And I am no longer responsible for supporting two adults. Ethan interjected, his voice strained. Mom, that's not fair. The rent, the bills, the debts. We were counting on you. You can't just cut us off like that. We rely on you. Margaret smirked, a bitter smile on her lips. Rely on me? Ethan, for the past 3 years, I paid for your home, your food, and even the wedding dress your wife wore. And in return, on the most important day of your life, you and Sophie told me I wasn't special enough to be there. Ethan fell silent, looking down. Sophie, however, lifted her chin, her voice high-pitched. The wedding is a different matter, but money is a family responsibility. You owe us. No! Margaret cut her off, her voice booming like thunder. I owe you nothing. The house fell silent. Ethan looked up, his eyes red with anger. If you don't help, we'll lose everything. Do you want to see us thrown out on the street? Margaret took a deep breath. She was still trembling, but for the first time in years, her voice was as steady as steel. No, Ethan. What I don't want is to continue losing myself. The air grew thick. Ethan and Sophie stared at Margaret, unable to believe that the gentle, quiet woman they once knew could be so firm. But she knew this wasn't just a conversation. This was her first battle to reclaim her dignity. After that tense confrontation, Margaret thought the silence would last for a while. But just 3 days later, she heard a car pull up in front of her house. It wasn't just Ethan and Sophie. This time, they were with a man in a suit, carrying a briefcase. When Margaret opened the door, Sophie immediately spoke, trying to maintain a fake, sweet tone. Margaret, this is Mr. Miller, our lawyer. He's going to help us resolve this awkward situation. The middle-aged man adjusted his glasses, offering a professional handshake, but with cold eyes. Ma'am, I've been retained by Ethan and Sophie to provide legal counsel. We are concerned about your ability to manage your finances. Suddenly cutting off all family support, refusing contact. These are signs of instability. Margaret stood frozen. In that moment, she understood their plan. If they couldn't get her money easily, they would try to prove her incompetent to gain control of her assets. Ethan looked down, but his voice remained steady. Mom, we just want to make sure you're properly cared for. If you let us manage your finances, you won't have to worry about anything. We'll take care of it for you. Sophie added with her usual deceitfulness. We just want to protect you. The older you get, the easier it is to be scammed. Better if we take care of everything for you. Margaret looked at the three of them, a chill running down her spine. She remembered all the times she had cut back on her own expenses to provide for them, all the times she had been disrespected. And now, they didn't just want her money. They wanted power, the power to decide her life. She replied slowly, her voice firm. You think you can take everything from me with a piece of paper? I have lived for over 70 years, raised a son to adulthood, managed a household, and survived the toughest of times. And now you're telling me I'm not lucid enough to keep my own money. Mr. Miller smiled, a smile full of implication. Mrs. Margaret, if there is a dispute, the court will decide. And if the judge finds you incompetent, then control will be granted to Ethan. Margaret felt the air thicken around her. This was no longer just family bickering. This was a real war, an open takeover attempt. She clenched her fists, but instead of trembling, Her eyes glinted with a new light. For the first time in her life, she saw her son and daughter-in-law's true faces. Their affection was just a facade. Inside, it was all about the money. Margaret nodded slowly, her voice calm but echoing a challenge. Very well. If you want to fight with the law, then I won't stand still either. Get ready, because this time, I will not lose. After Mr. Miller left, a heavy silence filled the house. Margaret sat down, her hands still trembling slightly. She understood clearly. This was no longer about daily reproaches, but a real battle, one where her son and daughter-in-law were trying to turn her into a senile old woman to seize all her assets. That night, Margaret tossed and turned. In the darkness, Miller's words echoed. If the court finds you incompetent, your son will take control. Her heart felt like it was being squeezed. But then a thought flashed. If they have a lawyer, then I can find one too. I am not alone. The next morning, she remembered Mr. Howard, a lawyer her late husband had mentioned. He was known for his integrity, specializing in protecting the rights of the elderly. Margaret took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and called. As she explained everything, Mr. Howard's voice was stern, yet empathetic. Mrs. Margaret, what you've just described is a form of elder financial abuse. It's more serious than you think. You are not the first, and you certainly won't be the last. Those words sent a chill down her spine, but also brought a sliver of relief. She wasn't crazy, as Sophie had implied. What she had endured was real, and someone recognized it. Howard continued. What we need to do immediately is gather evidence. All the transfers, bills, the money you spent on them, it must all be documented. We will turn the truth into a shield to protect you from any scheme. Margaret nodded. She had carefully kept most of the paperwork. For the first time, they were no longer wounds reminding her of her folly, but evidence for a counterattack. That afternoon, while sifting through her files, Margaret heard a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Collins, her neighbor from 2 houses down, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes. I heard shouting from your house the other night, Mrs. Collins said, her voice full of concern. Are you all right, Margaret? Margaret was silent for a few seconds. Then, for the first time, she opened up and told her story. When she finished, Mrs. Collins's eyes were red. Oh, my dear. I went through something similar with my own son. They exploit our love, turning us into walking wallets. But rest assured, Margaret, I will stand with you. If you need a witness, I am ready to testify that you are completely sane and that they were coercing you. Margaret was choked with emotion. She had thought she was alone, but now she realized there were still kind people by her side, people who understood and empathized. That evening, Margaret sat with Mr. Howard in his small law office. On the table were stacks of papers, receipts, bills, bank statements. Mr. Howard pushed up his glasses, his gaze sharp. They thought you were an easy prey, but things are different now. We will show them that Margaret is not someone who can be easily manipulated. Margaret looked at the stacks of paper, then at the lawyer. A new strength was forming within her. For the first time in years, she felt she was no longer a passive mother, but a warrior. In the small, brightly lit office late at night, Margaret sat across from Mr. Howard. On the table, thick files were neatly arranged. Bank statements, rent receipts, shopping bills, even the warranty for the air conditioner she had fixed for Ethan and his wife. Every piece of paper, every number, was evidence of the years she had been exploited. Howard opened his notebook, his voice firm. Margaret, Ethan and Sophie will certainly file a petition for financial guardianship with the court. They will try to prove you are no longer competent to manage your assets. We must get one step ahead. Margaret took a deep breath. Her hands clasped tightly. Do you really think they would do that? My own son, suing his own mother? Howard looked at her, his gaze serious. You shouldn't have any illusions, Margaret. When money becomes the goal, family ties can easily disappear. What's important is that we have evidence. And you need to prove to the court that you are completely lucid. He handed Margaret a list. Documents proving assets registered in your name, years of spending journals, health checkup appointments and medical results, a psychological evaluation from an independent doctor. We will build a solid case, not just to refute their accusations, but to turn the tables, to show who the real abuser is, Howard said, his voice full of conviction. Margaret looked at the papers in her hand, a strange feeling creeping into her heart. Before, those numbers only reminded her of her own foolishness. But now, they had become weapons. She was no longer just a victim, but was becoming the one wielding the sword on the battlefield. That night, Margaret called Mrs. Collins. Upon hearing the news, Mrs. Collins affirmed, "Don't worry, I will be a witness. I will tell the court that you are completely of sound mind, and I will describe exactly what I heard when they came to your house, coercing and threatening you." Margaret squeezed her neighbor's hand, her heart swelling with emotion. For so many years, she had believed she could only rely on her son. But now, the truth was clear. Sometimes, a kind neighbor is worth more than family. The day to file the documents arrived. Outside the courthouse, Margaret stood next to Mr. Howard, clutching the thick file. On the other side, Ethan and Sophie were already there with their lawyer, Mr. Miller, their faces cold, their eyes like daggers. In that moment, Margaret felt her heart pound. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was the heartbeat of a warrior entering battle. She whispered to herself, "I will not let them take my life away. Not this time." The courthouse doors opened, and the legal battle officially began. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was more crowded than usual. Many locals came to watch, as a son-suing mother story always sparks curiosity. Amidst the heavy atmosphere, Margaret walked into the courtroom in a simple black suit. Her steps were firm, as if to prove to the world that she was still standing strong. Ethan and Sophie sat on the plaintiff's side. They looked tired, but tried to maintain a dignified appearance. Mr. Miller, with a calculated smile, stood up first. "Your Honor, my clients, Ethan and Sophie, are extremely worried about Mrs. Margaret. In recent months, she has exhibited unusual behavior, suddenly cutting off financial support, installing an extensive camera system, and refusing contact with her family. These are clear signs of cognitive decline." He paused, glanced at Margaret, and continued. "We only want to ensure that Mrs. Margaret's assets and life are properly managed. That is why Ethan is petitioning for financial guardianship of his mother." A murmur spread through the courtroom. People looked at Margaret, a silver-haired old woman, then at the young couple sitting on the plaintiff's side. It was Mr. Howard's turn. He rose, his voice strong. "Your Honor, what the plaintiff's side says may sound humane, but in reality, It is a scheme for financial gain. Mrs. Margaret is not incompetent. On the contrary, she has been financially abused by her son and daughter-in-law for years. Howard held up the thick file. Here is proof that Mrs. Margaret has paid a total of over $30,000 to Ethan and Sophie over the past 3 years for rent, bills, personal items, and even Sophie's wedding dress. She sacrificed and in return received only disrespect. Her decision to end financial support was not unusual. It was a rational choice to protect herself. The tension in the air was palpable. The first to take the witness stand was Sophie. She teared up, her voice trembling as if she were genuinely in pain. Margaret was like a mother to me, but recently she has changed a lot. She's suspicious of everyone, including her family. She installed cameras everywhere, not letting us near. We're just trying to protect her. Howard approached for cross-examination. Miss Sophie, did you or did you not tell Mrs. Margaret that she wasn't special enough to be invited to her own son's wedding? Sophie was speechless. Her face flushed. She stammered, That was said in a moment of tension. I didn't mean it that way. Howard pressed on. Then why, at the wedding, was your entire family present, while your mother-in-law was excluded? Sophie remained silent. The courtroom buzzed with chatter. Next was Ethan. He stood up, his voice rushed. My mother has changed. She's being influenced by her neighbor and her lawyer. She doesn't trust her own family anymore. Howard asked directly, Mr. Ethan, how much money have you received from your mother in the past 3 years? Ethan avoided his gaze, mumbling, I don't remember. Howard held up the bank statement. $33,400. Not a small sum. Do you believe that someone with cognitive decline could manage her expenses and keep such clear receipts and records? Ethan was silent, sweat beading on his forehead. Finally, Margaret was called to the stand. She stood tall, her voice deep but firm. I raised my son with all my love, sacrificing my old age to provide for him. In return, I was treated like a wallet. They wanted me to keep paying, and when I refused, they labeled me as senile. I am not crazy. I am just more clear-headed than ever. The entire courtroom fell silent. The wrinkles on her face were no longer signs of frail old age, but proof of a resilient life. The judge looked at her and lightly tapped his gavel. The court will recess to consider the evidence. Margaret stepped down, her eyes meeting Ethan's. In that moment, she didn't see the little boy who once hugged her and whispered, Mom, you're my everything. Before her now was just a stranger, greedy and cowardly. The trial entered its second day. The courtroom was filled with tension. Ethan and Sophie sat on the plaintiff's side, their confidence diminished after the previous day's cross-examination. But they still had one last card to play. The witnesses prepared by Miller. Mr. Miller called Mr. Davis to the stand, the grumpy neighbor from across the street. He testified that Margaret acted strangely, installed cameras everywhere as if she were paranoid, and wouldn't let her family into the house. Miller nodded, as if certain of his victory. Howard approached, smiling. Mr. Davis, have you ever spoken directly with Mrs. Margaret about why she installed the cameras? No, but I saw it with my own eyes. Are you aware that just a week ago, her son and daughter-in-law broke into her house, brought a lawyer, and went through her private papers without permission? Mr. Davis hesitated. Howard pressed further. So you are judging someone as paranoid, when in fact she was just protecting herself from an invasion of privacy. Can you state the opposite under oath? The courtroom murmured. Mr. Davis looked down, his voice softening. No. Next, Miller called a pharmacist, Mr. Green. He testified that Margaret bought her medication irregularly, a sign of confusion. Sophie smiled, certain the tide had turned in her favor. But Howard approached, presenting a new document. Your Honor, this is a revised statement written by Mr. Green himself, affirming that he was misled by Sophie into signing a document for an unclear purpose. In reality, Mrs. Margaret only purchased vitamins and aspirin, with no underlying medical conditions requiring prescriptions. Mr. Green nodded, his face red with shame. That's right. I misunderstood. I was convinced it was just an insurance formality. I apologize. A stir went through the room. Ethan and Sophie sat frozen. Then came the final witness, something no one expected. Mrs. Collins, Margaret's close neighbor. She took the stand with a calm demeanor, her gaze direct. I have lived near Mrs. Margaret for many years. She is completely of sound mind. I even overheard the conversation when they came to her house to force her to sign power of attorney. Sophie said, "Everything you have will belong to us anyway." Those are not the words of someone wanting to protect. They are the words of someone waiting for an inheritance. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Ethan buried his face in his hands, while Sophie turned pale. Howard stood up, delivering the final blow. Your Honor, all the evidence is clear. Mrs. Margaret is not only lucid, but has been exploited, drained, and manipulated by her own relatives. The plaintiffs were not seeking to protect her. They were seeking control of her assets. And the truth has been revealed. In that moment, Margaret sat in silence, but her eyes shone with radiance. For years, she had been disrespected, treated like a walking wallet. Today, finally, the truth had spoken for her, in a crowded room and before the law. The courtroom fell silent as the judge tapped his gavel, signaling for quiet. On his bench, the thick case file was neatly arranged. He looked down to read it one last time, then looked up, his expression solemn. After reviewing all the evidence, witness testimonies, and the report from the independent psychologist, the judge's voice rang out clearly. This court finds Mrs. Margaret to be of sound mind and fully capable of managing her own finances. A whisper spread through the room. Ethan gripped the armrest of his chair, while Sophie bit her lip so hard it bled. The judge continued. Conversely, the evidence shows that Ethan and Sophie have repeatedly engaged in financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, and undue pressure on Mrs. Margaret. These are not the actions of protectors, but of predators. He paused, then struck the gavel again. Therefore, the court denies the petition for guardianship in its entirety. Furthermore, the court recognizes Mrs. Margaret's right to take legal measures to protect herself from any future abuse. The verdict cut through the air like a knife. Margaret closed her eyes, a single tear falling, not of sorrow, but of release. After so many years, the law had finally recognized her. She was not a senile old woman. She was a person with dignity and freedom. Howard placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder and whispered, "You won, not just in court. You won back yourself." Meanwhile, Ethan shot up, his voice a mixture of choked anger and disbelief. "This isn't fair. We're her family. Everything she has should belong to us one day anyway." The judge looked at him, his eyes like ice. Family is not a license for appropriation. Love cannot be compelled by law. You would do well to remember that. Sophie turned away, tears streaming down her face, but no one believed they were genuine anymore. Margaret stood up. She said nothing to them. There was no need. In her heart, the judgment had been passed long ago, a judgment of the heart, from the day she heard the words, "Only special people are invited." As she stepped out of the courthouse, sunlight streamed down on her face. It was the light of freedom, of a new chapter in her life. After the trial, Margaret returned home. The house was as quiet as ever, but the atmosphere was completely different. There was no shadow of anxiety, no incessant phone calls demanding money, only the steady ticking of the clock and the gentle light streaming through the window. She made herself a cup of tea and sat down at the dining table, a place that for years had been covered with bills, bank statements, and spending lists for Ethan and Sophie. Today, on the table, there was only a brand new notebook. She opened it and wrote the first lines. "My life, a new chapter begins here." The next day, Margaret went to the bank, not to transfer money out, but to open a savings account for her own plans. The bank teller looked at her in surprise, but she just smiled. "This time, this money is for me, and only for me." She also returned to the art studio, where her brushes and easel had long been covered in dust. The first strokes of color on the canvas made her feel young again. Mrs. Collins stopped by, teasing, "Margaret, you look even more radiant than that spring painting." They both laughed, the light-hearted laughter of women who had once been taken for granted, but now knew their own worth. Margaret also began to travel. She booked a train ticket to the sea, a place she and her husband had promised to visit for a holiday, but never had the chance. Standing before the vast ocean, the wind blowing through her silver hair, she whispered, "Robert, do you see? I'm finally living for myself." Occasionally, Margaret still thought of Ethan. In her memory, he was still the little boy who would hug her and whisper, "Mom, you're my world." But then she would remind herself, true love doesn't need to be bought, and if it disappears when the money stops, it was never love at all. One summer evening, Margaret sat on her porch, watching the twinkling stars. She took a sip of tea, her heart filled with peace. For the first time in years, she wasn't worried about anyone but herself. She was no longer a wallet with feelings, no longer a disrespected mother. She was just Margaret, a free woman. She smiled and whispered to herself, "True love is priceless, and freedom is never too expensive." Margaret's story concludes not with tears, but with the light of freedom. She walked through the pain of betrayal, through tense court battles, and finally stood strong on her own. From a mother treated as a walking wallet, she became a free woman, living her golden years to the fullest. The greatest message here is, true love never needs to be bought, and freedom is never too expensive to protect. And you, after hearing the story, ask yourself, if one day I were faced with the choice between continuing to sacrifice for disrespect or daring to stand up for my dignity, what would I choose? If you also believe that no one has the right to put a price on your love and freedom, please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear more moving stories like this one. Wishing you a peaceful night.